From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Tim Scott announces his run for the White House. Does the South Carolina senator have a realistic chance at winning the Republican nomination in what is becoming an increasingly crowded field? Plus, the debt ceiling talks broke down over the weekend amid mutual recriminations, but they've restarted after a chat between Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden. Will update you on the latest and explain why a default should be off the table. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here with Kim Strassel and Mene Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Let's start with Tim Scott announcing his presidential campaign with a surprise endorser, Senator John Thune of South Dakota, following Mike Rounds, the other South Dakota Republican, endorsing Mr. Scott. Let's listen to John Thune introducing the senator, followed by the senator himself.
He is a candidate who has a strong record of legislative accomplishment. I worked side by side with him through one of the most economically consequential pieces of legislation of the last several decades, and that was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. He was a relentless fighter for South Carolina and for people in this country. And he also is a candidate who comes into this race with boundless hope and optimism for this great country. He is an aspirational and inspirational candidate. And I don't know about you, but I think our country is ready to be inspired again.
We cannot have innocent people at risk, police officers getting ambushed and attacked, and seniors locked in their homes from the time the sun goes down until the sun comes up. Joe Biden and the radical left are attacking every single rung of the ladder that helped me climb. And that's why I'm announcing today that I'm running for president of the United States of America!
Well, there you go. Clearly an enthusiastic opening bid there. Mene, what do you make of Senator Scott and his announcement, and what are his chances?
Yeah, well, I think Tim Scott has exactly the reputation, both among senators and among the broader public, as much as they're aware of him, that John Thune was describing. He's known as a very optimistic guy. He's not a culture warrior in the way that Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, frankly, are known as. When he speaks publicly, he tends to talk about his biography, the way that he was born into poverty in the South, and miraculously, and through the help of a lot of strangers and his family, was able to ascend to becoming a U.S. senator. And when he talks about policy, it is always focused on spreading that opportunity to other Americans. And so that's the approach that he's going to take to the campaign. I think he's betting that a lot of Republicans are looking for someone with a more inspiring message of that kind after all these years of a very, very divisive politics. But frankly, there isn't really a clear sign that that's true yet. If you look at Tim Scott's poll numbers, he's averaging in the low single digits thus far. Of course, that could change after he gets more exposure, but it really does seem as if there is a strong appetite for more of a culture war inclined candidate right now. And so he's going to be making that speech and trying to sell his candidacy in the coming months and trying to see if there is more of an appetite for his inspiring approach than we have seen thus far.
Yeah, I think Kim Mene puts his finger on the challenge that Tim Scott has, but there's no question that that optimism that he conveys through his personal story, but also through the policies he stresses, which is focused on opportunity, is clearly something that has inspired John Thune, for example. He is well liked, Tim Scott is in the Senate. I mean, in fact, people who know him say it's impossible to dislike him as a person and a politician. And that's always a big advantage for any politician, including one who runs for president. If you're going to be in front of us for 4 years, people don't like to hate you, right? They like to actually say, yeah, I like that guy. I may disagree with him, but I can actually listen to him. And his personal story is inspiring. As Mene said, raised in poverty, helped by a Chick-fil-A franchisee who helped him get started as a businessman, good record in the Senate, school choice, promoter, evangelist for it, really. Tax reform, part of that opportunity zones is part of tax reform. In the Jack Kemp tradition of spreading opportunity in the Republican Party, a part of the GOP that frankly has not had a lot of public salience of late.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about Tim Scott's attributes and the things he has going for him. As you note, a very compelling story. One of my favorite stories about him is that when he was starting high school, he actually flunked a number of his core courses, and his mother made him go to summer school and moreover get a job to pay for the courses. So that kind of tells you a little bit about the
Right.
the family he was raised in. And if you read his speech today, I caught some of it live, I read the rest of it. He really tried to weave in that biography with the policies that he promotes and explain why things that he is supporting were so beneficial to him when he was growing up and why they would be beneficial to others. He is loved by donors. People really flock to him. He has $22 million in the bank as he begins his bid. And just to give a little comparison, Donald Trump, who, as we all know, is fundraising all the time, he had $14 million on hand at the end of March. This is going to allow Tim Scott to immediately launch $5 million in ad blitzes in Iowa and New Hampshire, the first two primary races, and try to familiarize people with him there. Iowa's going to be really key for him because he is also running a campaign that's very focused on evangelical Christians. He talks a lot about the deep nature of his own religion. And, go back to 2016, that GOP primary, evangelical Christians are very, very important in Iowa. 2/3 of them, as they came out of exit polls, said that they identified as an evangelical Christian. So he's going to be making a big bid to them. And then, the endorsements he got today. I saw a little Washington Post piece kind of ridiculing the fact that he came out with John Thune's endorsement. And they're like, who's John Thune, the senator from South Dakota? Well, actually, John Thune is a member of the GOP leadership in the Senate. And I think the really important aspect of having him and Mike Rounds come out today and endorse him was to send the message that there are members of the Senate, members of the House saying it is okay to endorse someone other than Donald Trump. And I'm sure that's what was on Tim Scott's mind as well as he had them introduce him. So he's got a lot going for him. We can certainly talk about the drawbacks, but that's what he begins with.
Monet, on the obstacles that he will face, in addition to a Republican electorate that may be more interested in grievance and, quote, retribution, unquote, as Donald Trump puts it, than in hope and optimism. He has never really had a hard race, Tim Scott. He's always had a kind of coasted to victory in South Carolina. This will be a tough race. And he also has competition from South Carolina. Nikki Haley, the former governor, already in the race. And that could complicate matters if he does well in Iowa and New Hampshire. Then the campaign will roll into the primary in South Carolina. Challenges that could divide support in state if Haley or one of them hasn't dropped out, and could presumably help Trump, who I think will not drop out. He'll keep going as long as he possibly can. A couple of obstacles he faces.
On the subject of Nikki Haley, I do think that will present a challenge for Tim Scott in the early part of his campaign as he's trying to establish a core base of support from which he can continue to roll out toward more. In terms of donors based in South Carolina, in terms of politicians in that state, she's going to be competing for some of those endorsements and some of those donations. And I would say that she has a slightly higher profile than Tim Scott. And again, if you look at the polling averages, she's performing slightly better than Tim Scott right now. So she has a little bit of visibility there. So Tim Scott is probably already angling to try to see if he can peel off some of that support and corner not only the power brokers, politicians, and donors in South Carolina, but also lock up a lot of support from voters there. But in terms of other obstacles, I do think that despite the fact that he's one of the best liked guys in the Senate, as we've mentioned, he does have some vulnerabilities in terms of the approach that he's taken to policy. Generally, his policy approach has been focused on compassion, trying to spread opportunity, but that can sometimes lead him to positions where he's dissenting from what might be called the conservative center. And so there are initiatives that he's done, like opportunity zones in the tax cuts bill that John Thune was talking about in the clip. And the idea of this was that it creates offset to allow investors to make tax-deductible investments in low-income areas. And yet, if you look at the track record since that policy was instantiated, it has led to a lot of abuse. There aren't really solid studies on how it's performed overall, but there definitely are instances of people who have invested in places that technically met the qualifications for a low-income area, but really were not necessarily serving or advancing the interests of very poor people. And you could go down the line with a few other policies that Tim Scott has worked on, and sometimes they do kind of help to sell an image of compassion, but not necessarily advance sort of core conservative interests in the way that primary voters would look to see. So I do think that his actual track record is going to be challenged by some of his competitors, too.
Speaking of competitors, the Republican field looks like it's now expanding pretty fast. In addition to Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, expected to get in this week or next. Mike Pence, former VP, gearing up to get in, and reports are that Chris Christie, the former New Jersey governor, may also join the race for what would be his second run at the top job, having run in 2016. With Donald Trump so dominant now, in the polling at least, certainly since he was indicted by Alvin Bragg, and Ron DeSantis second, kind of with 19, 20% in the polls. I mean, the challenge for Tim Scott and these other candidates is going to be, okay, how do you break through to become a solid third and then ultimately break through to get Trump one-on-one, Kim?
Yeah, and we're going to probably begin to see how some of this shakes out a little bit later this summer. These guys are all going to announce now because they want to start building up their names in those initial states, defining themselves and vis-a-vis Donald Trump and each other. But then later this summer, you're going to start getting the debates. In my mind, and that's when you really begin to get a little bit of insight into who may have a chance and not. Right now, and you speak to Republican voters, people I know around me, they're vaguely aware that this is going on. They're vaguely aware that there are candidates getting in, but they're just not focused on it yet. But it is going to be hard because, look, Donald Trump does begin with this base of support. He doesn't even have to work for it. And these guys are all going to have to find their niche. And it does look, just as a bigger point here, some people were suggesting nobody was going to get in to challenge Donald Trump. That was the view a year ago. This could be a really crowded primary field. Once again, maybe not as large as it was in 2016, but it could certainly have a lot of names and faces. And that's going to be a little bit tough as well, too, because you face the prospect of some people splitting the vote, Donald Trump having this base of support and everybody else getting what's left. That is exactly what happened in 2016, and something that all the Republican candidates who'd like to see someone other than Trump with the nomination might have to put a little bit more thought into this time around.
And as the primaries approach, after particularly the first debates in the autumn, first one now scheduled for August, if some of these candidates don't get traction, you're going to have to consider dropping out, I think, before the first primaries so they don't divide the votes of those who want somebody other than Trump. Otherwise, you'll end up with the same dynamic as 2016, where they were all hoping to be the last non-Trump candidate standing, and that helped Trump cascade to the nomination. So that's going to be the one calculation to watch as these candidates get into the race.